The council chamber of the Galactic Empire was one of the most powerful rooms in the known universe. It sat inside a hollow moon, carved out by a civilization so old that most species had forgotten their name. The walls were made of dark stone and pale crystal, and the light inside was always dim and steady, like the inside of a church that had never been touched by sunlight. Thousands of seats rose in wide rings around a central floor, and every seat was filled. 400 worlds had sent their representatives. The air was thick with noise, with the low hum of 1,000 conversations happening in 100 different languages, all of it running through translation nodes built into every chair so that no one missed a word. General Vexora walked to the center podium alone. He was tall, even by the standards of his own people. His skin was the color of old stone, gray and layered in flat plates that overlapped like armor. He had 4 arms, all of them long, and 6 eyes arranged in a shallow curve across the top half of his face. He had served the Galactic Empire for 80 years. In that time, he had fought in 11 major wars. He had commanded fleets that stretched across entire star systems. He had never asked for help, never retreated without order, and never lost a battle. The other generals of the Empire respected him the way that people respect things that are both very powerful and very old. They did not love him, but they listened to him. He raised one hand, and the chamber went quiet. He did not look nervous. He did not fidget or adjust his uniform or look around at the crowd. He simply stood at the podium and waited until the last voice had stopped, and then he began to speak. He said he had stood on 100 worlds. He said he had broken enemy fleets that outnumbered his own by 10 to 1. He said he had walked through the ruins of cities that belonged to civilizations which had dared to challenge the Empire, and he had felt nothing except the quiet satisfaction of work completed. He had never come before the council to warn them away from a fight. He had always come to tell them how the fight had gone, and the answer had always been the same. The Empire had won. Today was different. He told them he had sent 4 scout ships to the edge of a small solar system on the outer rim of Imperial expansion. The system was called Sol by the species that lived there. It contained a single star, several planets, and 1 world of particular interest, and a blue and green planet about halfway out from the sun, modest in size, with 1 large gray moon and a ring of stations and shipyards orbiting it. On that planet lived the species called humans. The Empire had been watching them from a distance for some years. They were young, as civilizations went. They had only reached space 300 years ago. By galactic standards, they were barely out of the nest. The scout ships had been sent to gather information. Nothing aggressive. Standard observation protocol. The same thing the Empire did with dozens of developing species every decade. The ships ran quiet. No active sensors. No transmissions. Just watching. Within 11 minutes of arriving at the edge of the system, the humans detected them, not with active scans, with passive ones. The humans had been running a monitoring network across the outer edge of their system and had been watching for exactly this kind of approach. They had, in other words, been waiting. A sound moved through the chamber at that. 11 minutes was fast. Even the Empire's own early warning systems would have taken longer to identify a ship running silent at that range. A few delegates leaned forward in their seats. Others exchanged looks. Vexora let the number sit in the air for a moment before continuing. When the scouts realized they had been detected, they began to pull back. They did not fire. They did not attempt contact. They simply turned and moved toward the edge of the system to make their exit. Standard protocol for a compromised observation mission. The humans responded by launching ships of their own, not warships, at least not in any shape the Empire's analysts had previously classified as combat vessels. They looked like freight haulers, big and blocky, the kind of ships that species used to move cargo between nearby moons. But they moved with a precision that no cargo hauler should have been capable of. They cut through space in tight, efficient paths, and they moved fast. They were chasing the scouts. Governor Zell of the Tharnic Confederacy laughed at that point. He was a large and confident man who ran one of the wealthiest systems in the Empire and had never been in a real battle in his life. He said, loudly enough for half the chamber to hear, that this sounded like a bluff, a primitive civilization trying to look dangerous. He said the general was wasting the council's time. Vexora turned his 6 eyes toward Zell. He did not raise his voice. He did not change his expression. He simply looked at the governor the way that a very large and very patient animal might look at something small that had made a sound. Then he said, "That is what the scouts believed as well." He clicked the control on the podium. The lights in the chamber shifted as a holographic display came to life in the open space above the central floor. It showed footage recovered from the one scout ship that made it back. The footage showed the human ships giving chase. It showed 2 of the 4 Imperial scouts being caught, pulled in by tractor field projectors, the kind of equipment normally used for docking and salvage, not for capturing military vessels. The chamber was no longer laughing. Vexora told them what happened next. The 2 captured crews were held for 18 days. And during that time, they were given food, medical care, and clean quarters. They were not interrogated. They were not threatened. No weapons were pointed at them at any time. When they were released, they were transported to the nearest Imperial way station aboard one of the human haulers. The human crew apologized for the inconvenience of the capture and offered to help carry any equipment the scouts needed for the journey home. The returned crews filed their reports and said, in their own words, that they had been treated better by the humans than they were sometimes treated at Imperial resupply depots. But that was not the part that made the chamber go quiet. The part that made the chamber go quiet came next. The released crews had been given something to bring back. A data package, compiled by the humans, and addressed directly and by name to the High Council of the Galactic Empire. Inside that package were schematics, detailed, accurate, complete schematics of every ship in the Imperial forward fleet near the Sol system. The humans had scanned them, fully, down to drive core configuration and hull plating thickness. They had done it during the pursuit, in the window between detecting the scouts and capturing 2 of them, and they had packaged the results neatly and sent them home with their prisoners as a kind of gift. High Chancellor Dorath, who had sat perfectly still throughout the entire presentation, finally spoke. His voice was low and very precise. He asked what the message in the data package said. Vexora told him. The message had been recorded in 17 galactic languages, and including 2 that the Empire had never shared with any species outside its own borders. It said, "We have seen you. We mean no harm. Please identify yourself before we are forced to assume otherwise." The chamber was silent for a long moment. Then Governor Zell, who had stopped laughing, quietly sat back down in his seat. Aaron Cole had been living among alien species for 6 years, and in that time, he had learned to read a room that had no humans in it. He had learned to watch the way that Veth delegates tilted their head plates when they were surprised, and the way that Keth representatives tapped their secondary fingers against their armrests when they were trying to hide worry. He had learned which silences were the comfortable kind, and which ones were the kind that came right before something important happened. The silence in the council chamber after Vexora finished his opening presentation was the second kind. Aaron sat near the back of the upper tiers, in a section reserved for cultural observers. He was a trade liaison for a small human commerce collective, which meant that in theory, his job was to facilitate agreements about raw materials and shipping routes. In practice, his job for the past 6 years had been to sit in rooms full of aliens and try to make humanity seem reasonable. He was good at it. He was a lean man with dark eyes and a habit of sitting very still, which several species interpreted as a sign of deep thought, and one species interpreted as a sign of illness, but which mostly just meant that he had grown up in a household where being quiet was safer than being loud. Beside him sat Dr. Lena Park. She was a xenolinguist. which meant she spent most of her professional life with her head inside a language that was not her own. She had been the one to compile the list of galactic languages that the humans had used in their data package message, a fact that she had not told the Council and did not intend to. She was small and precise in everything she did, from the way she took notes to the way she drank her water. She placed her hand on Aaron's forearm when the general began his second presentation, not because she was scared, but because she knew what was coming and thought it would help to have something solid to hold on to. He did not pull his arm away. The second part of Vexora's presentation covered what the Imperial Intelligence Division had been able to gather about humanity from the data package itself, and the humans had included in it not just the fleet schematics, but a broad collection of their own public records. History, science, art, population data, infrastructure maps, trade networks, agricultural output, medical research. It was, Vexora said, the most complete first contact package any species had ever voluntarily submitted to the Empire. It was also, he added quietly, clearly assembled by people who wanted to be understood and were not afraid of being looked at closely. He started with the shipyards. The holographic display shifted to show orbital maps of the Sol system. The humans had 17 major shipyards in operation, scattered across the orbits of their inner planets and around the large gas giant they called Jupiter. These were not small facilities, and several of them were larger than the Empire's primary construction docks in the Keth sector, which had been built over 2 centuries and were considered among the finest in the galaxy. The human yards had been built in 60 years. Governor Zell, who was still sitting quietly after having stopped laughing, stirred at that. He asked how that was possible. 60 years was not enough time to build facilities of that scale. Vexora said the humans had done it by working in shifts, 3 crews, around the clock, every day, in conditions that most galactic engineers would have refused without additional compensation, and that the humans had simply accepted as the normal pace of a project that needed to get done. He moved on to the mining operations. Humans had been extracting resources from their asteroid belt for almost a century. And they had stations on moons with no atmosphere and no natural warmth, kept alive by their own technology in environments where a single equipment failure could kill everyone inside. They had a colony on the 4th planet in their system, a cold and thin-aired world they called Mars, where roughly 40,000 people lived in pressurized habitats and grew their own food in sealed greenhouses. The colony was self-sufficient, had been for 20 years. Lena let go of Aaron's arm at some point during this section. She had opened her small notebook and was writing in it quickly, in the shorthand she used when she was thinking fast. Vexora then showed the Council footage from the capture of the 2 scout ships. This footage came from the human side. I included in the data package as if they had known the Council would want to see it from both angles. The human ships, which looked like haulers, moved with the kind of precision that only came from pilots who had spent years operating in tight orbital windows where the margin for error was measured in meters. They did not hesitate. They did not communicate with each other in any way that the Imperial analysts had been able to detect during the approach. They simply moved, as if each ship knew what the others were going to do without needing to be told. When the scouts were caught, the footage showed the moment of contact clearly. The tractor fields engaged, the scouts were pulled in, and within 30 seconds the hatches were being opened from the outside. The human crew that entered the scout ships was not in combat armor, and they wore standard work suits, the kind of thing a maintenance team would wear in a pressurized bay. They carried no visible weapons. The first human through the hatch on each ship held up both empty hands before doing anything else. A Veth delegate in the upper tier said something to her assistant that the translation nodes rendered as, "That is a very old gesture. It means the same thing in almost every language." The footage continued. The scout crews, who had every reason to expect the worst, were moved to a set of comfortable quarters inside the hauler. Meals were brought. A human medic checked them over, treating a minor injury that one of the pilots had gotten during the capture. The scout crews, according to their own later reports, spent most of those 18 days sleeping, eating, and talking among themselves. And because there was nothing else to do and no one was threatening them. The human crew, for its part, left them largely alone. A young man with short brown hair and a calm manner came by once a day to check if they needed anything. He introduced himself on the first visit as Kevin. He brought extra blankets on the third day because the temperature in the quarters was running slightly low, and he apologized for the delay in fixing it. Captain Dara Webb, the third human observer in the council chamber, sat 2 seats down from Aaron and Lena. She was a decorated officer in the Human Outer Reach Defense Force, attending the session as a military attaché. She had served on 3 different ships in her career and had done 2 tours of duty in systems where the work involved more than just patrol routes. She was not a person who was easily impressed, but watching the footage of Kevin the crew member bringing extra blankets to the captured Imperial soldiers, she felt something in her chest that she recognized as pride, simple and clean, without any complicated feelings attached to it. Vexora paused the footage. He told the council that the data package also contained something else. Alongside the public records and the fleet schematics and the first contact materials, the humans had included a single short document. It was not addressed to the council. It was addressed specifically to the crews of the captured scout ships, by name, in their own language. It thanked them for their patience. It said the humans understood that the situation had been stressful and that they hoped the scouts had been comfortable. It wished them a safe journey home. It was signed by the captain of the hauler, a woman named Carol Briggs. High Chancellor Dorath looked at the data for a long moment after Vexora finished. Then he asked the question that the whole chamber had been waiting for someone to ask. He asked, "What do they want?" Vexora said that as far as his analysts could determine, the humans wanted exactly what their message had asked for: to be recognized, to have a conversation, to not be treated as something to be absorbed without being consulted. He said that in his professional opinion, this was the most dangerous thing about them. The third section of Vexora's presentation took almost an hour. He had prepared it carefully, because he knew it was the part that the council would push back on the hardest. And he wanted to make sure there was nothing in it that could be easily dismissed. He began with a simple fact. Humans had been at war with each other for as long as they had written records. He let the chamber absorb that before he continued, because he knew what the reaction would be. Several delegates did exactly what he expected. They laughed. They exchanged glances. They made quiet comments about how this proved that humans were primitive, unstable, and not worth serious concern. A species that could not stop fighting itself was not a species that posed any real threat to a unified galactic empire with 300 fleets at its disposal. Vexora waited for the laughter to finish. Then he said, "Look at how they fought." The display shifted to show a timeline of human conflict. Centuries of it. He compressed into a visual that showed not just when wars happened, but how they changed over time. Early conflicts were small and local. Over centuries, they grew larger, more organized, more destructive. Then, in a period of roughly 200 years, something happened that very few species did on their own without outside influence. The humans developed weapons capable of destroying their entire civilization, and then they spent the next 100 years not using them. This was not a small thing. Vexora made sure the council understood that. He had studied more than 60 civilizations in his career. He had seen what happened when a species developed that level of destructive capability. In almost every case, at least one faction used it. Sometimes because they were desperate, sometimes because they miscalculated, and sometimes because one leader decided that the risk was worth taking. The result was always the same. The civilization collapsed to a level where rebuilding took centuries, if it happened at all. Humans had not done this. They had come close, many times, by their own records. There had been moments when the distance between a decision to fire and a decision not to fire had been measured in minutes, but each time someone had chosen not to. Not because they lacked the willingness to fight, Vexora said. They had shown repeatedly that they were willing to fight. But because enough of the people making the decision understood that using those weapons was not a war. It was an ending. He paused and looked out over the chamber. A species that can talk itself back from the edge of its own extinction is a species with something unusual inside it. He said. Most do not manage it. Humans did it more than once. That is not luck. That is a pattern. He moved on to their expansion into space. The early years had been brutal by any standard. The first human spacecraft were built with technology that the galactic community would have considered dangerously primitive. Their propulsion systems were unreliable. Their life support margins were thin. Their navigation tools were simple. In the first 50 years of human spaceflight, they lost more than 200 personnel to accidents, equipment failure, and environments that were simply not compatible with an unprotected human body. After every loss, Vexora said, they did the same thing. They stopped. They reviewed what had happened. They found out what had gone wrong. And then they built it again, differently, and tried once more. He pulled up a specific example from the human records. A mission in the early period of their space program where a small crew had survived a catastrophic equipment failure through a combination of emergency procedures and improvised solutions. The crew had been 3 days from death when they landed safely. In the years afterward, human engineers had studied that mission so thoroughly that the lessons from it were still being taught to new crews 300 years later. Dara Webb, sitting in the observer section, knew that story well. Every human officer did. She had been tested on it 3 times during her training. She did not think of it as an inspiring story exactly. She thought of it as an accurate description of how her people approached problems, which was, you do not give up because the situation looks bad. You look at what you have, you figure out what can still work, and you use it. The chamber was very quiet during this section of the presentation. The laughter was gone. Some delegates were leaning forward. Others had stopped taking notes and were simply watching Vexora with their full attention. He spent the next portion of his presentation on the physical nature of the human body, which was something the Empire's biologists had found deeply interesting when the data package was analyzed. Humans were soft-bodied by galactic standards. No natural armor, no particularly impressive strength or speed compared to other advanced species. They were vulnerable to temperature extremes, to radiation, to a long list of pathogens and environmental conditions. On paper, they were not built for the kind of expansion they had achieved, but they had built tools for all of it. Suits that kept their bodies warm in the cold of space. Habitats that maintained pressure on airless moons. Medical treatments that extended their working lives and repaired damage that would have ended the career of almost any other spacefaring species. They had compensated for every physical weakness they possessed with technology and stubbornness in roughly equal measure. One of the Veth delegates asked a question at this point. She asked whether the humans ever complained about the conditions they worked in. Vexora said yes, frequently and at considerable length, but they did not stop working. There was a small ripple of something through the chamber at that. It was not quite laughter and not quite unease. It was the sound of an audience that was starting to understand something and was not entirely sure how it felt about it. The final section of the third presentation covered the handful of external conflicts humans had been involved in since making contact with fringe elements of the galactic community. Pirate groups, territorial disputes, 2 incidents involving species that had moved into systems the humans considered part of their expansion zone without asking first. The pattern in all of these was consistent. When humans were threatened or attacked, they responded quickly and with significant force. There was no lengthy period of negotiation first, no formal warnings in the traditional galactic style. They assessed the threat, they decided what level of force was appropriate, and they applied it. The conflicts were short, and the outcomes were decisive. But the moment the other side stopped fighting, the humans stopped too. There was no continued destruction, no pursuit beyond what was necessary to make sure the threat was finished, no burning of territory as a message to others. They ended the fight, and then they left. Admiral Cross of the Second Armada, who had been quiet throughout the presentation, spoke up here. He said that sounded like a species that was simply not thorough enough, that leaving enemies standing after a victory was a strategic error. Vexora looked at him for a moment before answering. He said that was one interpretation. Another interpretation was that humans did not fight to destroy. They fought to stop a specific problem. When the problem was stopped, so was the fight. The distinction, he said, was important, because it meant that humans were not aggressive in the way that truly dangerous species were aggressive. They did not expand by force for the sake of expansion. They did not attack unless they had a reason. But when they had a reason, and when the fight came to them, they did not hold back, and they did not stop until it was over. He looked at the chamber. The question, he said, was whether the Empire wanted to give them a reason. Governor Zell had been quiet for a long time, and that was unusual for him. He was not a man who stayed quiet when he had opinions, and he had many opinions. He governed one of the wealthiest systems in the Empire, a position he had held for 20 years through a combination of political skill and a talent for making the right friends at the right moments. He had never served in the military, and he had never been in a real fight, but he had been in 1,000 arguments, and he had won most of them, and he believed firmly that confidence was most of what winning required. He stood up before Vexora had finished his final point. He said the general was presenting a detailed case for why they should be afraid of a single-system civilization with no galactic alliances, no formal military designation in imperial records, and a total population that was smaller than some of the Empire's mid-tier member worlds. He said this was not a strategic assessment. It was a collection of interesting stories dressed up as strategic assessment. He said the math was simple. 300 fleets against one solar system was not a war. It was an afternoon. Several delegates applauded, not all of them, but enough to make the sound significant. Vexora let the applause end. He did not look bothered by it. Then he said, "The math is exactly what concerns me." He walked through it slowly, the way that a good teacher walks through a problem that looks simple on the surface, but has something difficult hiding inside it. Yes, the Empire had 300 fleets. Yes, the humans had one solar system. If the campaign were run as a standard integration, the Empire would win. Vexora had no doubt about that. He was not standing here to tell them the humans could beat the Empire in a straight fight. They could not. Not yet. The word "yet" sat in the air for a moment. He continued. He said the question was not whether the Empire could win. The question was what winning would cost, and how long the winning would take, and what the Empire would look like when it was finished. And he asked the Council to consider what they knew about how humans behaved when they were under pressure. Not the pressure of a trade dispute or a local conflict. Real pressure, existential pressure, the kind that made a civilization look at itself and decide what it was made of. He pointed to the data from their own history. He pointed to the weapons that could have ended them. He pointed to the moments when human civilization had stood at the edge of collapse and the people making the decisions had chosen to keep going instead. He said that this pattern, this specific pattern of refusing to stop even when stopping would be the easier choice, was the most important thing in the entire data package. Not the fleet schematics, not the shipyard maps, not the capture of the scout ships, the pattern. He said, if we attack them, we give them a common enemy, and a species that has already proven it can unite itself against the one thing that could end it entirely will unite itself against us with everything it has. We will win the first battle, probably the first 10 battles, but we will not be fighting against the fleet they have today. We will be fighting against the fleet they will build tomorrow, and the day after and the year after that, in shipyards that are already among the largest in this region of the galaxy, and that will run at full capacity the moment we give them a reason to." Admiral Cross leaned forward and said that was speculation. He said the Empire had integrated resistant civilizations before. It was not an easy process, but it was a manageable one. Vexora said, "Name one that had 17 major shipyards before first contact," and Cross did not answer. Vexora said, "Name one that could build a facility to rival the Keth sector docks in 60 years. Cross still did not answer. Vexora said, "Name one that, when its military personnel were captured by an unknown alien force, filed formal reports that were more concerned with equipment inventory than with the experience of being held." This last point was new. He clicked the control and brought up excerpts from the scout crew's debriefing reports, the ones they had filed after returning to the way station. The reports were professional and detailed and almost entirely focused on what had been observed about the human vessels and personnel. There was almost nothing in them about the emotional experience of the capture. One crew member had noted that the food was good, and another had mentioned that the quarters were warmer than his bunk back at base. That was the extent of the personal commentary. High Chancellor Dorath, who had now been watching everything with the careful attention of someone who was doing very serious thinking, spoke up for the second time in the entire session. He asked Vexora what he was recommending, specifically. Vexora said he was recommending 3 things. First, that the forward fleet be stood down from combat readiness immediately, not withdrawn, but stood down, kept in position, but made clearly non-threatening. Second, that a formal diplomatic mission be dispatched to the human system, led by a species with a strong first contact record, one the humans had not encountered before and had no reason to be suspicious of. Third, that the integration campaign for the Sol system be removed from the schedule entirely, not postponed, removed, and that any future decisions about the Empire's relationship with humanity be made through negotiation rather than force. He said, "I have fought 80 years for this Empire. I have never told this council to back away from a fight. I am telling you now. Not because I think we would lose, but because I think the cost of winning would change what this Empire is in ways we would not recover from." Governor Zell said that was a remarkable amount of caution from a general who had never lost a battle. Vexora looked at him steadily and said, "I have never lost a battle because I have never started one I did not need to start. That is not caution. That is how you stay undefeated." Aaron Cole in the observer section had not moved in the last 20 minutes. He was watching Vexora the way that he watched things when he was committing them to memory. Lena had stopped writing in her notebook. Dara Webb had her arms folded and her chin slightly raised, which was what she did when she was trying to hold her expression steady. The chamber was very quiet. Then High Chancellor Dorath said that the council would recess for the evening and that formal debate would begin in the morning. He said all delegates should review the full data package before the session resumed. He said this matter would be treated with the seriousness it deserved. He did not say which way he was leaning. He did not need to. The people who had been watching him closely enough already knew. Vexora stepped back from the podium, collected his materials, and walked off the central floor without looking at any of the delegates. He had said what he had come to say. The rest of it was not up to him. The debate lasted 3 days. Aaron Cole attended every session. He sat in the observer section with Lena on his left and Dara on his right, and he watched the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy argue about his species. It was a strange experience. He had spent 6 years working to make humanity seem reasonable and approachable and worth doing business with. And here was a 4-star general doing it better than he ever had, with harder evidence and a more direct delivery style. He was not sure whether to feel grateful or slightly embarrassed. Governor Zell led the argument for the integration campaign. He had recovered from the surprise of Vexora's presentation and returned to his usual form, which was confident and loud and skilled at framing things in ways that made his position sound like the only sensible one. He talked about precedent. He talked about what it would look like to the rest of the galaxy if the Empire hesitated in front of a single-system civilization that had been in space for 300 years. He said the Empire's strength was not just its fleets. It was the certainty that the fleets would be used when they needed to be used. Hesitation, he said, was a message, and it was not a good one. Several delegates agreed with him. The ones who governed border systems were particularly worried about the precedent argument, and they had spent years managing small civilizations that pushed boundaries because they believed the Empire could be negotiated with. Showing softness in front of humanity would encourage others to try the same thing. Admiral Cross submitted a formal counter-assessment on the second day. It was a detailed military analysis concluding that Vexora had overstated the human threat. He acknowledged the shipyards and the industrial capacity, but argued that industrial capacity required time to become military capacity and that a fast, decisive campaign before the humans could mobilize would resolve the matter before their production potential became relevant. He estimated the campaign could be completed in 4 years. Vexora was asked to respond. He said 4 years was long enough for humans to build a great deal, and he said he would stake his record on that. He did not say anything else. The arguments went back and forth. By the third day, the chamber had settled into the kind of slow, grinding debate that happened when a large group of powerful people all knew that the decision they were about to make was going to matter for a very long time. Voices were lower. The grandstanding had mostly stopped. Even Zell was more measured in his final arguments, making his points carefully rather than loudly. On the morning of the fourth day, High Chancellor Dorath called for the vote. The integration campaign was rejected. 61 votes against, 39 in favor. In its place, the Council authorized the formation of a diplomatic mission to the Sol system. It would be led by Ambassador Sevra of the Keth Compact, on a species with a long and respected history of first contact work. The Keth were patient, careful, and known throughout the galaxy for their ability to build trust with civilizations that had reason to be suspicious of outsiders. They were also, notably, a species that humanity had never encountered, which meant there was no existing impression to overcome. The forward fleet was not immediately pulled back. That required additional orders and coordination, and it would take several weeks. But the command to stand down from combat readiness was transmitted within the hour. The fleet would hold position, but would not move toward the human system, would not run active scans, and would not respond to any human communication attempts except to confirm that the communication had been received. Anarin got the news on his communicator while sitting in the station's observation lounge. He read the summary twice, then set the communicator down and looked at the stars outside the window. He had grown up reading about space as a place full of possibility. His grandmother had told him stories about the early missions, the ones where everything could go wrong and often did, and the people who went anyway because someone had to go first. He had always thought of space as something that humans were growing into, slowly and with a lot of difficulty. He had not expected to be present when the galaxy decided how to think about them. Lena came in a few minutes later with 2 cups of a hot drink that the station served as a coffee substitute. It was not very good. She had learned to make peace with it. She set 1 cup in front of Aaron and sat down across from him. He told her the vote had come through. She said she knew. She had been monitoring the council channel on her own communicator. They sat quietly for a moment. Outside the window, the stars were the same as they had always been. Nothing had changed out there, but something had changed in the room behind them, and Aaron could feel it the way that you feel a shift in pressure before a storm. He said he kept thinking about how close it had been. 61 to 39 was not a large margin. If Vexora had been less thorough, or if Dorath had leaned the other way, or if the Keth delegation had been smaller and less influential, it could have gone differently. Lena said that was how it usually worked. Someone said the thing that needed to be said, and then everyone else decided whether they were going to listen. Dara Webb appeared in the doorway a few minutes later. She walked in without being invited because that was how she did things, pulled a chair over, and sat down with the straight-backed posture of someone who had spent 20 years in uniform and would probably never fully lose it. She told them that in about 5 hours, Ambassador Sevra's advance team would want a briefing from the human observers on station. Cultural context, communication style, things to know before the formal mission launched. She said the two of them were the most qualified people available for that briefing, and she expected them to be ready. Aaron asked what she thought they should focus on. Dara thought about it for a moment. She was not a person who answered questions quickly when the question was worth taking seriously. Then she said, "Tell them the truth about us. Tell them we are difficult and stubborn, and we complain about things constantly and we still do them anyway. Tell them we built stations on rocks with no air because the resources were there and we needed them. Tell them we came as close as any species has ever come to ending ourselves, and we stepped back. Tell them that when something catches our attention, we do not let it go until we understand it completely. And tell them that if they come to us with honesty and with the intention of dealing fairly, there is no better partner in this galaxy. But if they come to us with a different plan, they should know that we will figure it out. We always figure it out." She looked out the window for a moment, and then she said, "Tell them we are worth the trouble." Aaron looked at his coffee substitute and then at the stars and then at Dara, and he thought that she had probably just given him the best summary of humanity he had ever heard. General Vexora, for his part, left the council station the morning after the vote. He filed his full report with the Imperial Military Archive before departing. It was a long document. The executive summary was short. The final line of the summary said, "They are not what we expected. They are more complicated and more capable and more determined than any early assessment suggested. Approach them with honesty or do not approach them at all." The report was classified at the highest level of Imperial security. Access was restricted to senior military and government officials only. Within 12 years, it was the most widely read document in the known galaxy. Nobody ever found out how it got out. Historians later speculated that someone had decided it was simply too important to stay locked away. Others thought that the humans themselves had found a way to obtain a copy and released it quietly, which would have been very much in keeping with their character. Ambassador Sevra arrived in the Sol system 14 months after the vote. The humans had been tracking the diplomatic convoy from the moment it crossed the outer edge of their monitoring network. By the time Sevra's ship reached the orbit of the third planet, there were 17 human vessels waiting to escort it in, all of them with their running lights on and their communication channels open. The first message from the human side was simple. It said, "Welcome. We have been waiting for you. Come in safely." Sevra later said, in the report she filed after the first month of talks, that she had been doing first contact work for 40 years and had met more than 30 new civilizations. She said humans were the first species she had encountered that seemed genuinely happy to have company.